Really excited to have Chris Totten with us tonight. Really special thanks to the speaker series for bringing Chris to us tonight, as well as the School of Art and Design. I want to give a quick introduction, and of course at the end of the talk, hope you'll stick around and ask some questions of Chris as well. Christopher Totten is an associate professor and program coordinator of the Animation Game Design program at Kent State University. He's also an award-winning independent game designer, artist, and animator. He holds a master's degree in architecture, an M.Arch, with a concentration in digital media from the Catholic University of America. Chris is a co-founder of the Smithsonian American Art Museum Arcade and a lifetime member of the International Game Developers Association. He was a member of the inaugural class for the IndieCade Horizons Faculty Excellence Awards, winning the Innovation Award for his work building an appreciation for games in the context of the arts. He has written multiple books on design, including an architectural approach to level design and World Design in 2D Action Adventures and World Design for 2D Action Adventures. He is also the editor of the collected volume Level Design, Processes and Experiences. Please join me in welcoming Chris Totten to UW-Stout.
Thank you for coming, everybody. Is this thing on? I'm going to project. So, hi, as Dave very kindly said, I'm Chris Totten. So I'm going to give this lecture is kind of an overview of stuff I've done, but hopefully teasing out some lessons, especially for the students in the room, so they can kind of get a sense of this weird connection between games and the arts. So here's who I am. I don't even really need to go into this because that lovely introduction. Here's a list of stuff I've done and some pictures. But I'm going to start with a really weird question. So I want us to think about two questions in the talk. So this first is kind of broad. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. The first is kind of broad, but it's something I like the students to think about in this room. What does success mean in games? Now, this is really important because the game industry is kind of big, kind of small, kind of weird, and often very unfriendly. And if you follow game industry news, you may know very unfriendly. So, it's always a question of my students, especially like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with this thing? So hopefully I can give some perspective on that. The other one that I like to start with on this talk, but don't worry, I'm not really seriously asking this. Are games art? Which is a terrible question. It's a garbage question, if I'm being completely honest. But it does provide this weird context of a lot of what I talk about. At the beginning of the 2010s, Roger Ebert famously wrote this article about how video games cannot be art. And it started a whole storm of reactions on the internet. And sometimes you see this question bubble up in game contexts. I'm not really actually interested in this question, but it does provide, like the stuff that came from this, provide a lot of this weird context for like the backdrop for how my career played out. So why is it a bad question? Well, one, it's already from very practical and cultural reasons been answered. In 2011, the Supreme Court said that games are art, both because the case Brown versus the Entertainment Merchants Association said that you couldn't restrict games from stores, but it also included language likening games to other mediums protected by the First Amendment, such as books, plays, movies, and the like. But then you also saw these movements like in 2012, the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. ran the Art of Video Games exhibition, which highlighted the history of games, of the games medium. So that exhibition got a lot of flack because for various reasons, some of them earned, some of them not so earned. But there was some, dissent against it because it included mainly like commercial games. Like, okay, we've put Mario in the Smithsonian. Why? But for this, the sort of mainstreamness of the works involved, when there's like plenty of kind of more artistically driven games out there. And now, to be clear, I love Mario. He's on my laptop. But people were like, really, commercial games? Why? But it provided this metric that museum administrators found really hard to argue. And that was record-setting audience visit numbers. So, when Hideo Kojima's talk sells out in 2 minutes, and the previous record was 10, we've got something here. And this opened the door to a lot of other museum game exhibitions, games getting included in museum collections, like the MoMA has several video games on permanent display. So this became sort of a big thing in the last decade, was museums got into having games in the museum. One that was from now more than a few years ago, but feels like a few years ago. What is time anymore? In 2019, a museum near my house, near Kent State, had the Open World Video Games and Contemporary Art exhibition that showed fine art inspired by video games or made using video game making tools. So you started seeing what people complained about with art of video games. Why are we mainlining all of these mainstream video games? That kind of thing had to happen for people to start exploring these other more tertiary, more experimental areas. So this brings us closer to my actual research question. How do games, or can games, participate in the landscape of art and design? How can we, forgot to turn on my timer, how can we use the knowledge of art, design, and the humanities to analyze games? And on the flip side, how can games be used as analytical tools to understand established cultural artifacts? So this might seem a bit blasphemous to some of the students in the room. I think it's important to note that this line of inquiry, or at least the way I practice it, is not really interested in exploring trends in gaming technology, especially not that one that everybody seems to be arguing about lately. Let's just not talk about that, okay? While you make digital games using software tools, game design is a much broader field than clicking buttons in interfaces. We're not on a path to make the same thing with prettier graphics. That word design is incredibly important because in a historic sense, design and art aren't products of software use. They are understanding structure in the ways humans perceive space, understanding the juxtaposition of formal elements like shape and color and how they create meaning and story, understanding how the mind interprets symbols to push the boundaries of what is identifiable, and even just playful trial and error. I'm also a big believer in what I call the industry academic loop. Industry activity like publishing games allows me to form new theories of making and understanding games, which lead to new research publications. All of this in turn helps me bring both new content to the classroom as well as industry experience that I can relay to students as they start their own careers. Hey students, I did a Kickstarter, ask me about that. Or I had somebody troll me online about my game, ask me about that. Showing my work in class also helps me get feedback, which then helps me make my games better. So just one big loop. This is all very intellectual, but the core of my research is very practical. Making games is a way to explore the relationships between games and the cultural landscape. Not are games art, but rather talk about what kind of art they are and how they exist in that landscape of other art forms. So as an educator, I'm also very interested in how we make those relationships clear to others and maybe even teach people to form their own connections. Now, I exist in this weird world of game studies, which is this kind of youngish field, and it's this absolute, like, if you've ever seen The Addams Family, where Gomez has his train set, and he like collides the trains together at the end of the train set, that's what game studies is. Because it's all of these people because there wasn't game design school. There's like sociologists that are like, I like games, and there's psychologists that like games, and philosophers that like games, and architects that like games. And then they just cram us into these conventions, and we're all like, wait, that's not how you look at design. This is how you look at, no, that's not how you look at design. That's, huh? So what I've learned semi-recently is that the way that my mind works as somebody that comes from design and art is really weird compared to the rest of game studies. So I'll give you an example, and I'm going to pick on literary studies for a second. So it's common to view games as literary works, and it's really cool. I love that. But these quotes, which are very long, I don't expect you to read all of them, describe some literary traditions that tend to analyze aspects of work, like the formal aspects of a work, separate from their social aspects. I would never divide the two of those in my architecture work because, yeah, I'm seeing some like weird looks on some of the faculty faces. Yes, exactly. You know, the structure of the thing is how we affect the social reaction to the thing. I design an atrium a certain way. People gather in the atrium. I wanted that to happen. But there's these divides. And I don't point this out to pick on literary studies. I point this out to point out that our brains in this room work in very different ways that there is not a lot of in game studies and game design theorization. And that gives us this like unique perspective that other people are really hungry for. So it was in the earliest part of my design background that taught me the importance of bringing these seemingly disparate mindsets together to create practical solutions. So going back to my own college days at CUA, I have both bachelor and master's degree in architecture from there. I was always taught that the design of a work was the means through which we would make impact in the world. Things like site, form, history, cultural context, the needs of a building's users were all important factors in analyzing and building stuff. And as often with art, the formal elements of the work are the means to communicate or influence the social elements of the work. And that's something you see a lot of in my designs. So my career in game making also started while I was in school. I was on my school swim team, and I had a friend who was like our swim team captain. He was also a computer science major. And I knew Photoshop and how to make art. And he said the famous last words, "We should make a video game together." I love the groans from the, that's great, yeah. We didn't make much besides this bad Tetris clone, which is 20 years old. I forgot that it's 20 years old. And then I made this slide and was like, oh my God, this happened 20 years ago. But I'd caught this game design bug. Right? I thought that this was so cool. And I read books like Rules of Play by Katie Salen Teckenboss and Eric Zimmerman and saw that they were talking about games in the same analytical way that my professors in textbooks talked about buildings. And through the prompting of a classmate, I tried to do the same with my school projects. She was like, hey, you know, you've been reading about game design. Have you ever thought about putting that into some of your architecture work? And like you could have seen the light bulb from space when that happened. So that became like my thing. It was pretty cool. So this eventually led to my grad school thesis where I combined elements of game design and architectural design. I made a game that architects could play to learn about this crossover. I even got some help on my project from a designer at Valve that used to be an architect. And I got to visit Valve, so that was neat. So instead of going into architecture after graduation in 2009, because nobody was building buildings, because recessions, I ended up getting a job teaching 3D art at a school with a games program. And I became heavily involved with the Washington, D.C. Chapter of the IGDA. I attended game jams, and I also even became a GDC conference associate through the recommendation of a friend of mine from the IGDA. All of which helped me meet some of my heroes, like Tim Schafer here, develop a portfolio of indie game projects that I was a part of, and most importantly, make some lifelong friends. So in 2014, after working on a bunch of mobile games with typical 3D art, I wanted to experiment with different art styles. I was kind of tired of doing the same 3D art all the time. And I'd been hired to work on a 2D mobile game where this character, it was like it's not an endless runner, it was like an endless flyer of sorts. And the character would grab these balloons out of the air and then his head would get bigger. and he would like float into space. And so after seeing a few games made with craft materials, I thought I would try the same thing. So I got this like craft foam from like Michael's, and I made game assets. These are in a box in my basement right now, which is incredibly rewarding to like be like, here's my video game. And I also used cotton balls for clouds. This ended up being a really satisfying way to do art, and it was some of the fastest game art I'd ever done. I could do the game's art in like a week. It's a small game, but still was able to do it really fast. And this got me to thinking about how, as a game developer and a teacher, I'd seen a lot of game engines that made game making easier through things like visual scripting, but I'd not seen art get much easier. So for a lot of new users, programs like Maya present significant challenge in making game art. Even Photoshop can seem overwhelming to first-timers or people who aren't like digitally engaged. So I thought, how can we use people's existing skills to make games? So I thought about that craft foam and thought about how there are a lot of real-world art skills and materials that aren't being used in games at the time. I also thought about games that had come out recently at the time, like Dominic Pamplemousse by developer D-Squinkifier, which used clay and other craft materials to create game assets. And I thought we should be advocating for using people's existing art skills in game making. While I'm far from the only developer to do game art with real-world processes, again, this is like a thing that bubbles up every few years, I wanted to see if I could make it into a documented process that could be used to teach others to make games. In 2015, I made Liziski's Revenge, which is a crossover of the work of Russian constructivist artist El Liziski and the Atari 2600 game Yar's Revenge. So let's see if YouTube will behave. It will. So when Stranger Things had a character get stuck in a Russian prison, they played that song in like the episode, and I was like half paying attention at the time, and I heard it, and I was like, flashback to my trailer, because it's just public domain music, right? So the goal of the project wasn't just visual novelty, but also to get the attention for game making with traditional art processes by working from the styles and methods of famous artists. Constructivism was a style of art about the positioning and arranging of shapes. So Liziski's Revenge was a game that allowed players to form their own constructivist artworks through action gameplay. If you take a screenshot while playing Liziski's Revenge, you've just made a new piece of constructivist art because you're like moving the tools in real time. So I wanted this to be part of a series called Atelier Games, named after the studio teaching method where young artists would study under a master and adopt elements of their style. The goal was to make small games in about a month, each after a different artist. In this way, I could explore game art more deeply through the close studies of the artists. The series ended up not happening as like a formal series, but the process has become something of a through line in a lot of my work, and you're going to see that show up. Also around the time, I had the opportunity to turn the research that I had done for my graduate thesis into a book on level design. So when I went to the Game Developers Conference, GDC, I talked to a lot of level designers, and I saw that there was a general curiosity about architecture, but nobody really knew where to start. And I was like, wait a minute, I know where to start. That's like my thing. A friend recommended me to his publisher, and I was able to write my book, An Architectural Approach to Level Design. So this book explores the design of game environments in terms of architectural design principles, integrating not only aspects of building design, but of landscape architecture, urbanism, and lots of stuff, putting it into a critical language for game worlds. Again, the goal here was to hold game spaces up alongside their architectural precedents so that scholars and industry designers could use them in their work. So like, how is falling water like a video game map? You know, you can see the connections between these things. Also around the same time, those are a very busy few years. Another friend of mine in the IGDA connected me with their contact at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Smithsonian American Art was looking for another video game event to do, and as the head of our DC chapter of IGDA, we were looking for a indie festival to submit to that wasn't out in California. So it was like, what if we brought a bunch of indie game developers and took over your courtyard? They're like, great, awesome. So we had the first Sam-Arcade in 2014. About 4,000 people came. It was really successful with like minimal promotion. People just were like, holy cow, video games in the museum. And it became a yearly event that's still going on. So we're pretty excited about that. A key part of the event was not only making something for typical gamers, but also having people of different generations and backgrounds coming together over their love of the medium. I've actually had developers at this event come up to me at the beginning of the day and say like, this is cool, but like, and points over to the arcade machines. Why do those have to be here? Like why are we still doing this? Why can't like the artful games be their own thing? And then once they see people actually come and interact with them, and then like parents playing with their kids and being like, this is Pac-Man, but then that being the key to discovering these indie games, and then people getting excited to meet the indie game developers. Like that same person that complained to me came up to me later that day and was like, I was wrong, I get it. I'm like, yeah. So it's this like little ecosystem of not only the games being on display, but people's reactions to the games being on display, and that really matters. And then right after this time, this curiosity about games and other forms of art really solidified as a research direction. So you hear a lot about bad or unstable working conditions in big game studios, but I can tell you that they happen even in like academic studios, even ones that make like pro-social friendly, meaningful games. One that I worked at had a designer who would speak down to like all the programmers, all the artists, basically anybody that like did the making of the game. He was very much like an idea guy sort of person. And he literally said this at one point, I'm the architect and you're all just subcontractors building my vision. Now this offended me both as a game artist, but also as a person with 2 degrees in architecture. But it did make me think that for all of our discussion of the artfulness of game design, we don't really dig into the games and see how the art, music, sound, levels, or individual components can be themselves artful, even though like the people that make them are coming from these backgrounds that are very informed, that have, we are in a school of art. Artists go to schools of art. They learn about the history of art, the methods of art. Composers do the same thing. And they, composers for video games tie their compositions to classical references. So all of these are part of this big lineage, but we don't really talk about that. So my storytelling game, La Mancha, is a game that explores some of these ideas. It's a game created to teach and explore the themes of a great piece of literature, Miguel de Cervantes' 1605 novel, Don Quixote. By playing the game, players explore the story and the literary criticism that has been said about the novel by making it their own, finding their own solutions to challenges that the main characters face, but they get to like come up with their own solutions to them through storytelling. So I'll give you an example of how individual parts of the game like accentuate this storytelling and these themes. Because sometimes when you make like serious games about things, they tend to work with very broad top-down rules. But this game takes like each individual card and makes it sort of a piece of literary criticism about something in the novel. So the windmills card, which is based on the one, like the scene from Don Quixote that everybody knows, where he like fights windmills. When Don Quixote does this in the novel, it ends badly for him. He's lifted into the air by the windmill's blades, and he breaks both his helmet and his lance. In the game, players who fail a die roll lose access to their helmet and weapon for a turn, and are at a disadvantage until like their next turn. But then the character card Altisidora, which is a character from like much later in the novel, represents more symbolic elements of the novel. In the book, it's a chivalric romance. It's a chivalric like novel. And that would have been like, Don Quixote being a parody of this would be like making a parody of a Marvel movie today. That was like the dominant, pop media of the time. So this character in the book actively mocks Don Quixote for his devotion to this like knightly, courtly love, right? And in the game, players can devote themselves to a love for extra power. But this character jumps from player to player, upending these relationships as she tried to do in the book. So basically, like she ends up being sort of like shooed away from players, but then attached to other players, and thus like ruining this part of their loadout of power granting, knightly things. So using game interactions in this way is inherently critical. The mechanics you design form arguments about your interpretation of a work. And they can be kind of like writing a term paper about a book, right? Except you are actually enacting it instead of writing it out to be passively consumed. So in recent years, Sam-Arcade also evolved to incorporate yearly themes. In 2018, I was asked to curate specific theme collections of games, and so decided to show games that expressed individual parts of games in some interesting way, to go along again with this research direction and this question about, can we look at the individual parts of games as themselves works? In 2018, the theme was game spaces, featuring games that utilized level design or architecture in a novel way. 2022's theme was color, line, and form, and that celebrated these elemental aspects of art and how they were incorporated into games and the game assets. Now, I started working at Kent State in Ohio in 2018, and so I really wanted to bring some of what we did with Sam-Arcade to Ohio, to local museums. In 2019, we brought a similar event called Open World, and it was going along with that contemporary art exhibition. But what happened after that, because something happened in 2020 where we couldn't have game festivals. But we kept that event alive for a few years before, museum turnover, people move on. But we kept the event alive for the next few years by creating a virtual gallery. So we worked from Paolo Pedercini's open source framework for online museum galleries that he created for a gallery that he runs in Pittsburgh called Like. And we took that set of code and set of assets, and we customized it for Akron Art Museum. We even reimagined avatars in the Like online project using the artworks that are part of Akron Art Museum's collection. And we made it so that you could play as works from the museum as you explored entries in that year's game design gallery. So before I get to the latest stuff, I want to cycle back around to those questions from the beginning of the talk. I already kind of took all the air out of this one, but I'm gonna beat a dead horse some more. So the answer, I think, to this is that's not, again, it's not a great question. It's a bad question. Stop asking it. But it depends on what you think art is. If you think of art as the product of human creativity or visual culture made with personal intent, sure. But what I think people try to ask when they're asking this is, can we exalt games in some way where they are above criticism? Which is a terrible misunderstanding of what art is. So if that's you, please don't think that. But I think what makes this an important question to revisit not to actually try to ask it, but is to think of like, how can games participate in the artistic process? How do we curate them? How do we curate them among other arts? How do we analyze them as artworks? How do we break a chunk off and understand, you know, we had critiques today in the capstones, right? And so much of the feedback came from other spaces. Animation, have the silhouette of this character be more unique so that I can recognize it from far away. Spatial design, you know, how can we make this flow of spaces work better? Oh, go look at this work or this building or this level. You know, you can start to incorporate these into one language of precedence rather than have them be this sort of like, oh, video games are over here and art and the rest of human culture is over here, right? I think it's more important to start thinking about how they can fit together. So that's a lot of what my work is. It's just trying to put games, figure out where they go. But this does bring me to the first of my final takeaways from all of the work I've done. So the first is to have a rich outer life. Now, a lot of my students come to game school because they like games. Pretty normal. That's why I make games. But they come to school and they like to make games, but there's a little bit of an undertone sometimes, I feel, of like, haha, I've hacked college. I don't have to learn about all that college stuff. I'm sorry you do. But here's why. Because if you just make video games and like from a point of view of consuming other video games or from the point of view of consuming animation, you know, you're only going to make video games that look like other video games. So I made a joke online and it got some reactions, like good reactions, and I'm going to, you know, make this reference here. Who here has seen a movie called The Blues Brothers? Okay, so in this movie, it's about a band that, I mean, they're on a mission from God, but like at the moment they're trying to get gigs, right? And they get a gig at a country western bar, and they go to this bar and they say, "We're the band," and they're like, "Oh, hey, it's the band." And you know, Jake, one of the Blues Brothers, Jake, he asks, "What kind of music you got?" Or no, Elwood asks, "What kind of music you got here?" Dan Aykroyd. And they go, "Oh, we got both kinds, country and western." Well, I was reading Play Nice by Jason Schreier, which is a history of Blizzard Entertainment, the people that made World of Warcraft. And there was a line in it that, I kid you not, it was like, well, our last game was a fantasy game, so the next game has to be sci-fi because that's the other thing. So it's like that joke from the Blues Brothers, except it's in a multi-billion-dollar industry. Don't do that. So have that rich outer life. You're going to notice a lot of my work has been games in architecture or games in art or games in literature. Some of it was about putting games in the same places as other types of art and letting them talk to one another, or letting players have input on the work of art itself and seeing how artwork and literature play out when people are in charge of it. Most of the GDC talks I see are, I went and learned about this other thing from this other field, and then I applied it to my game design, and here's what happened. That's like a pretty safe GDC topic, right? Do that. You know, if you can go to museums, go walk in the woods, take something from your life outside of games and incorporate it into your games, and you're going to find some really awesome combinations. So the other question I wanted to discuss is, what does success mean? Now, you probably guessed this, but there's not a part of this that ends with me working at a big game studio. Or as I like to say, I've made lots of games, but I've never made a Star Wars. And I know people who've worked on Star Wars. At the beginning of my career, when I started teaching game art, I had hoped to build up a portfolio, use that time to build up a portfolio that might catch the attention of a big studio. But over time, I grew into my role as a teacher, and and as a member of my indie community. Working as a professor at universities, I became really good at mentoring students through projects, and I had some producer roles in like educational games made by university game labs. Through my industry contacts and work, I did eventually hear from some big studios about production positions. But by that time, I'd gotten married, I had a family, and was making things that I liked that were like self-motivated. And I decided that AAA wasn't something I'd wanted to do. My priorities just shifted. So understand that like everything you make has meaning, and sometimes those priorities can shift. So sometimes success in the industry means just, it does mean working at a big studio for some. And some folks want to make $1 million, right? Weird things happen when I get together with my game designer friends at GDC though. Those friends who work at big studios are like, oh my gosh, I downloaded your game or I read your book and thank you for doing that and I had a blast with your work. And I'm like, you work at Square. You work on Final Fantasy. I have a friend who did marketing at Square for Final Fantasy 15 because he looked exactly like the main character from Final Fantasy 15. And I'm like, you are literally Prince Noctis, and you're like, your game was awesome? That's wild. But this is what happens, is that, you know, everybody is just out there excited for each other, supporting each other. But also, you don't really know that, you know, it doesn't have to be that you work at a big studio. Sometimes you release a thing. Everything you release, everything you make matters. It might matter to somebody by becoming their favorite game. It might matter to somebody because they just think it's weird and fun and it helped them make a cool YouTube video. But also, everything you make is just experience in making. You know, your class projects are experiences in making. You are farther along in your career by making a class project game than you were before you made that class project, or that little Space Invaders clone, or that terrible Tetris clone, right? You've been through the game making process, and that's like an experience. So keep making stuff. This is why in the early part of your career, they also tell you to fail faster. You're gonna make bad stuff, that's okay. Make it quickly, but you're gonna learn sometimes more from making bad things than you will from like huge successes. Third takeaway is make friends, not just status connections. The people I've met through IGDA, the Conference Associate Program, even just around industry events have been beacons of support, collaboration, and yes, connections. But those connections don't mean much unless you truly build relationships with people. In the early days of M.Arch, we had this person who would always find big name judges to look at the games because they were like contacts he'd made. And he'd always come to meetings and say, you know, having them involved in the event will give it more prestige. But then when it came time to actually do something, because that person wasn't invested in helping this person that called them up for this thing, they'd always flake, even though they were a big name. It was all the people that the rest of us got who were our like friends and colleagues that we'd worked on that we could trust that got the thing done. So that really matters. Like, don't just kind of make shallow connections. You know, don't just think of the connections you make as transactional. Actually, like, tend to the garden of your friend list. Show up, be kind, and keep showing up. Just show up for a long time. Because again, I had another weird conversation in the last few years at GDC. A friend of mine came up to me and said, someone just called me a legend. That's weird. And that thing had happened to me earlier that day, you know, in like another situation. And I don't say that to brag. I say this because we both looked at each other and kind of realized that being like a recognizable industry person is sometimes just a matter of like being around for a while. So don't let the industry take you down. Participate in it, make stuff. Yeah, you might even have periods where you're not in the games industry, but again, tend to those connections and just make stuff. Make little things. It's okay. All their projects matter. So to finish, I wanted to look at some new stuff. Last year, I finally launched a game on 2 Nintendo consoles with the release of my Nintendo Switch and Game Boy game, Kudzu. Now, this is not a game about art at all. I just wanted to try out a new game engine called GB Studio and make a Zelda, because I like Zelda. But it does have a lot of inside jokes that my wife and I have between us, like turned into video game form. Our cats are in it. So here's that trailer. So Kudzu seems like a little tiny project, but it did challenge me to extend my level design abilities to include the challenging Metroidvania style of game. For those unfamiliar, Metroidvania games are large mazes. They're called Metroidvania because the typical games are from the Metroid and Castlevania series, so Metroidvania. That's how we name genres in games. They're explored, they're open-ended, you explore them in an open-ended way, and actions you take, such as beating bosses or solving puzzles, have permanent effects on the world. But progression in these games are really hard to plan. They are huge, like, challenging games to make. So making this not only pushed my skills, but also gave me a whole new set of level and architectural principles to work with for world design, which I later published in my most recent book. But this also leads me to another takeaway, which is, like, love the medium, you know. And that seems silly, but, like, I've worked with a lot of people who try to make very self-serious things. And you can make very artful things, but try to make artful things with don't forget that love of the medium. Don't forget that whimsy. Don't always just try to, like, impress people with your cool photorealistic, gritty guy art. Right? Have, like, even really dark, scary games have, like, a really funny component. You know, if you've ever played Resident Evil 4, that's a horror game. It has the funniest merchant ever. If, you know, like, there's a game called Elden Ring. It's very dark, very moody. You get attacked by giant lobsters. You say, holy crap, lobster, like, run away. I like to explain that game to people by being like, remember the bunny scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Extrapolate that to, like, a 150-hour game. But that's because it's goofy. There's, like, an underlying silliness to that game. So be whimsical. Put your cats in the game. Pet the dog, right? For those who don't know what I'm talking about, there is a social media account called Can You Pet the Dog? That's actually become, like, a criteria of a good game now, is, like, can you pet the dog? But it is, like, whimsy, have whimsy. And then, of course, there's the game Little Nemo and the Nightmare Fiends, which I'm making with conference associate friends of mine, again, collaborators. This game brings together a lot of the threads from this talk, which is why I wanted to save it for last. It is based on an important work of comics and animation history, which is the 1905 Little Nemo in Slumberland comic by Winsor McCay.
Hey, do you recall the moonlit skies in Slumberland?
You bet I do.
Where rockets soar and the nights are never long enough.
Come on, give me 5 more minutes here.
Don't worry when a big old turkey plucks you up and carries you on. Just close your eyes.
Surprise!
You're on your way, my
You
child.
know, I'm almost 7 now.
The land unseen where a barren dreams run wild. With crystal queens a breaking.
What? Why's the bar to
Oh,
sing?
certain that you haven't been. It's likely that you have. Okay, you may have been beguiled.
Whoa,
So
whoa.
grab a friend by the hand. And let us go to Slumberland. The grandest, picturesque kingdom that's ever been
So we're drawing heavily from McCay's original work with an art style based on the original comics. It has hand-drawn keyframed animation and characters and settings from the original. So I alluded at the beginning to this idea that games could be a way to analyze artworks. This game is a challenge. Like the question behind this game is, can art direction in games be a way to reconsider the works of a famous artist? I also just really like this comic a lot. We're being very playful with how we approach the project. The playfulness lets us use our game's art direction, again, as that critical tool. So what if Winsor McCay had known about, like his work is very famous for being very architectural, having these big architectural vistas that are all based on like one specific thing, the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. What if he had known about other things, like Antoni Gaudi in Barcelona making Sagrada Familia at the time? We can find that out because we can make that world. We can invent the world where he knew about Antoni Gaudi. We can also then do things like, because it's in the public domain, we can pull parts of McCay's artwork, both to use as environment artwork, but then also maybe to do something like create a shader that incorporates his cross-hatching into 3D models. And then we can also look at McCay in terms of the artists that he influenced. Now, that is countless, but you know, by using like Disney's 12 principles of animation, we can look at McCay's early influence on animation and think, well, what if he had access to the 12 principles more fully worked out? We can see what Nemo and friends are like in that 12 principle style of animation. Or we can look at artists that worked on later Little Nemo work. So in the early 1990s, late 1980s, there was a Little Nemo like movie, and it actually was a horrible like development hell project, yeah. But Hayao Miyazaki worked on it for a minute, and he didn't like the project at all. He took his ball and went home, and that ball was all the work that became Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. So we're like, what if we had that in the game a little bit? Or what if we had the work of Moebius, French comic book creator Moebius, who was a Little Nemo Winsor McCay fanboy, right? So we wanted to incorporate those things. So what if we kind of fold back McCay's influence into this thing and create, like, juxtapose these things together? McCay's influence, but also works influenced by McCay. So to recap, lessons from a career so far in games and art: have a rich outer life. Every project has meaning. Make friends, not status connections. They will be your lifeline, you know, to keep your career going. Keep showing up, but be nice to people. It's a small industry. You think it's a big industry? It's a small industry. Like, it's a one-room church in a small town amount of small. Not even a small town, a little tiny church in that small town. So be nice to people, and then just be whimsical with your work. Don't take it too seriously. Have fun with it, and other people will latch onto that. And I think I have a few minutes for Q&A. That's where you can chat with me. But yeah, thank you.